the haunted house that no one escapes, a terrifying true horror story on Ridgeway Lane.
Jess and her boyfriend, Ethan, were thrilled when they landed the deal of a lifetime, a 3-bedroom house in the quiet suburbs of Ridgeway Lane. The house, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac, had all the charm they could ask for: large windows, creaky hardwood floors, and even a small garden out back. They moved in late one Friday night, excited to start a new chapter in their lives. But something about the house felt off. On their first night, as they unpacked boxes, a faint, rhythmic thumping sound echoed through the walls. "It's probably the pipes," Ethan said with a shrug. Jess wasn't so sure. The noise felt too deliberate, too purposeful. As they lay in bed that night, the thumping continued. It seemed to travel from room to room, stopping just outside their door. "Do you hear that?" Jess whispered, clutching the blanket tighter. Ethan mumbled something about old houses and fell back asleep. Jess stayed awake, heart pounding, as the sound eventually faded into silence. The next morning they found muddy footprints trailing through the living room. Jess stared in disbelief. "Did you track this in last night?" she asked. Ethan shook his head, frowning. The prints were larger than his feet. "Maybe a neighborhood kid broke in," he suggested, but the door was still locked, and no windows were broken. Jess felt a chill crawl up her spine. Later that day, while Jess tended to the garden, an elderly woman approached her from the sidewalk. She introduced herself as Mrs. Holloway, a longtime resident of Ridgeway Lane. "You bought the old Baker house?" Mrs. Holloway asked, her voice tinged with concern. Jess nodded, sensing unease. "You be careful in there," the woman said, lowering her voice. "Strange things happen in that house. The Bakers were good people, but they left in a hurry, never even came back for their things." Jess laughed nervously, brushing off the old woman's warning. But that night, she couldn't shake Mrs. Holloway's words. The thumping returned, louder this time, and it seemed to echo through the vents. Ethan got up to investigate but found nothing. As he returned to bed, Jess noticed something chilling. On the fogged-up window by their bed, a single handprint appeared. She gasped, her voice trembling as she pointed. "That's impossible," Ethan muttered, wiping the glass clean. But as soon as he did, the handprint appeared, larger and more defined. Ethan laughed nervously. "Probably condensation." Jess wasn't convinced. The next day, Jess decided to explore the basement, a place they'd avoided during the move. It was cold and damp, filled with shadows that stretched longer than seemed possible. As she sifted through forgotten items left by the Bakers, she found a dusty box tucked in the corner. Inside were Polaroids of a family, a mother, father, and a young girl. They all wore matching smiles, but the girl's eyes were strangely lifeless, staring past the camera. Underneath the photos was a notebook with the name Maggie scrawled on the front. Most of the pages were filled with childish drawings, stick figures, and sunny skis, but toward the end, the pictures grew darker. One drawing depicted a faceless figure standing at the foot of a bed. Another showed a girl screaming as black hands dragged her under the floorboards. Jess slammed the notebook shut, her hand shaking. That night, the thumping turned into scratching, sharp, deliberate sounds that seemed to come from beneath their bed. "Ethan, it's coming from the basement!" Jess cried. They grabbed a flashlight and headed downstairs. As the beam of light swept across the room, the scratching stopped. But then they saw it, a small trapdoor they hadn't noticed before, partially hidden under an old rug. Ethan hesitated. "It's probably just storage." Jess shook her head. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Ethan hesitated before pulling back the rug to reveal the trapdoor. It was old, the wood splintered and stained as if it had absorbed decades of secrets. A rusted iron ring served as the handle. Jess felt her stomach knot as Ethan reached for it. "Maybe we shouldn't," she whispered. Ethan gave her a tight-lipped smile. "It's probably nothing, just an old root cellar." With a grunt, he yanked the door open. A blast of cold, damp air hit them, carrying a stench so foul it made Jess gag. The flashlight's beam revealed a steep staircase leading into the darkness. The walls were lined with dirt, and the floor below seemed to glisten unnaturally. "Stay here," Ethan said, stepping onto the first creaky step. Jess grabbed his arm. "No way. I'm not letting you go down there alone." Reluctantly, he nodded and they descended together. At the bottom, the flashlight revealed a small, circular chamber. The walls were etched with crude symbols that Jess didn't recognize, twisting, jagged lines that seemed to shift when she stared too long. In the center of the room was a wooden chair, its arms fitted with leather straps. Deep grooves marred the seat, as if someone or something had clawed at it in desperation. Ethan stepped closer, his face pale. "What the hell is this?" Before Jess could respond, they heard a faint giggle, high-pitched and echoing. It came from the far corner of the chamber, where the shadows seemed thicker. Jess gripped Ethan's arm, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you hear that?" Ethan nodded, shining the flashlight toward the sound. The beam illuminated something horrifying, a small, pale hand reaching out from the shadows. "Run!" Ethan shouted, dragging Jess up the stairs. As they bolted back into the house, the trapdoor slammed shut behind them with a force that rattled the walls. Jess leaned against the kitchen counter, struggling to catch her breath. "What the hell was that?" she gasped. Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at his hands, which were trembling violently. Jess followed his gaze and froze. His fingers were smeared with something dark and sticky. "Is that blood?" Ethan shook his head, his voice shaking. "I didn't touch anything down there." Suddenly, the rhythmic thumping returned, louder than ever. It came from all around them, echoing through the walls and floors. Jess screamed as the lights flickered, plunging the house into darkness. Then, they heard the same giggle from the basement, this time much closer. "Get out!" A voice rasped low and guttural. Jess and Ethan fled the house, leaving everything behind. They spent the night in their car, parked at the edge of Ridgeway Lane. As dawn broke, Jess pulled out her phone and began searching for the history of their house. What she found made her blood run cold. The Bakers hadn't simply left in a hurry, according to old news articles. Their youngest daughter, Maggie, had vanished from her bedroom one night. The police had found no signs of forced entry, but neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from the house for weeks before her disappearance. The Bakers eventually moved away, claiming the house was cursed. Jess scrawled further, finding an old photo of the family. Her heart sank as she recognized the girl from the Polaroids in the basement. Ethan groaned, rubbing his temples. "This is insane. We can't stay here. Let's call someone, anyone." Before Jess could respond, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. "You can't leave. She won't let you." The color drained from Jess's face as she showed the message to Ethan. The thumping began again, faint but unmistakable. Only this time, it wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the trunk of their car. "Did you lock the basement door?" Jess asked, her voice trembling. Ethan stared at her, his face pale. "I thought you did." As the thumping grew louder, Jess reached for the car keys, her hand shaking uncontrollably. "Don't," Ethan said, his voice barely a whisper. "What if it's her?" Jess swallowed hard, her fear turning to resolve. She pressed the button to unlock the trunk, and it creaked open slowly. Inside was a single item, the notebook from the basement. It was open to a fresh page, where a message had been scrawled in blood. "You belong to me now." Jess slammed the trunk shut, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. She turned to Ethan, whose face was ashen. "This isn't real," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "It can't be real." Jess wanted to believe him, but the evidence was undeniable. Something from the house had followed them. The thumping started again, this time coming from underneath the car. The house, nestled at the end of an old Adzia, had all the charm they could ask for: large windows, creaky hardwood floors, and even a small garden out back. They moved in late one Friday night, excited to start a new chapter in their lives.
Drive!
Jess yelled. Ethan jammed the key into the ignition, but the engine sputtered and died. The thumping grew louder, more erratic, shaking the car.
Get out!
Ethan shouted, flinging his door open. Jess scrambled out on her side, and they ran down the street, not stopping until the car was a distant speck behind them. Breathless and trembling, they collapsed on a bench near a dimly lit park. The silence around them felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Jess pulled out her phone again, scrolling through more articles about the house. One caught her eye: The Curse of Ridgeway Lane, a string of disappearances tied to the Baker home. As she read, her stomach churned. The article described a pattern of events eerily similar to theirs. New families moving in, unexplained noises, strange symbols, and then people vanishing without a trace. Couple missing after move to Ridgeway Lane, last seen driving a black sedan. Jess gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She showed the article to Ethan, who shook his head in disbelief. "That's not us," he muttered, though his voice betrayed his doubt. Suddenly, Jess's phone screen flickered, the light dimming. A notification popped up. "Maggie wants to come home." Jess dropped the phone as it buzzed violently, the screen going black. "What does she want from us?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Jess could respond, the park lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. A soft giggle echoed through the air, followed by the sound of footsteps, small, deliberate, and getting closer. "Run!" Jess screamed, grabbing Ethan's arm. They sprinted toward a nearby convenience store, its neon sign flickering weakly. Inside, they huddled by the counter, gasping for breath. The cashier, an older man with tired eyes, glanced at them warily. "You two look like you've seen a ghost." Jess hesitated before blurting out, "It's the house on Ridgeway Lane. Something's wrong with it." The man's expression darkened. "You mean the Baker place?" He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "No one who's ever run from that house has made it far. It's not the house you should fear, it's what's attached to you now." Ethan paled. "What do you mean?" The man straightened, his gaze cold. "You've been marked. You can't run from her. Maggie always comes back to claim what's hers." As the cashier spoke, the store lights flickered, and the thumping started again, this time coming from the aisles behind them. Jess turned, her heart stopping as she saw a shadowy figure at the end of the aisle, a small girl, her eyes hollow, her smile wide. The lights went out. A scream echoed through the night. The screen cuts to black with faint, echoing laughter. A message appears. What happened to Jess and Ethan? Discover the chilling history of Ridgeway Lane in our next video.